The cemetery was quiet, the way Daniel liked it. Every Sunday morning, without fail, he would walk the same path, past the old oak tree, around the crumbling stone angel, and straight to the grave marked Lena Carter, beloved wife. It had been 2 years since cancer took her, but for Daniel, the pain was still fresh, like an open wound that refused to heal. This Sunday was no different, or so he thought. As he knelt to place the white roses, her favorite, on the grave, he sensed movement. From the corner of his eye, a boy, maybe 16 or 17, stood a few feet away, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his gaze fixed on Lena's headstone. Daniel frowned. He had never seen this boy before. "Did you know her?" Daniel asked, his voice rough from disuse. The boy hesitated, then nodded. Yes. There was something in the way he said it, a weight, a sadness that matched Daniel's own. But before Daniel could ask more, the boy turned and walked away, disappearing between the rows of graves. Daniel stared after him, a strange unease settling in his chest. Who was he? Why had he been standing at Lena's grave? That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He replayed the moment in his mind, the boy's quiet presence, the way his eyes had lingered on Lena's name. It didn't make sense. Lena had never mentioned knowing any teenagers. Had she been a mentor? A teacher? The next Sunday, Daniel arrived earlier, half hoping, half dreading to see the boy again, and there he was, standing in the same spot as if waiting. This time, Daniel approached him directly. "You were here last week." The boy nodded. "I come every week." Daniel's pulse quickened. "How did you know my wife?" The boy looked at him then, really looked at him, and Daniel saw something that made his breath catch. Lena's eyes. The boy swallowed hard. "She was my mother." Daniel's world tilted. The words hung in the air between them, sharp and impossible. She was my mother. His first instinct was to laugh. This had to be a joke, some cruel mistake. Lena had never been pregnant. They had been married for 15 years, and in all that time, she had never once mentioned a child. But the boy's face, those eyes, so much like hers, stopped him cold. There was no humor in his expression, only a quiet, aching truth. For a long moment, Daniel couldn't speak. The wind rustled the leaves overhead, the only sound in the heavy silence. His mind raced, scrambling for an explanation. Had Lena been hiding something all these years? Had she given up a child before they met? The thought made his chest tighten. She had been the most honest person he knew, or so he had believed. Now, standing in front of this stranger who carried her eyes, he wondered if he had ever truly known her at all. The boy shifted uncomfortably, as if sensing the storm inside Daniel. "I didn't mean to just show up like this," he said quietly. I didn't know how else to find you." Daniel's voice came out rough, barely controlled. "What's your name?" Ethan. Ethan. A simple name. Ordinary. But to Daniel, it felt like a key turning in a lock, opening a door he hadn't known existed. He studied the boy, Ethan, more closely now. The shape of his jaw, the way he held himself. There were traces of Lena there, yes, but also something else. Something that made Daniel's stomach twist with a strange, reluctant recognition. "How old are you?" Daniel asked, though he already dreaded the answer. 17. 17. Daniel did the math without wanting to. If Ethan was 17, then he had been born before Lena and Daniel had even met, which meant... His thoughts were cut off by Ethan reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a folded envelope, yellowed with age, and held it out. "She left this for you. I only found it a few months ago." Daniel stared at the envelope. His name was written on it in Lena's handwriting, the same looping letters he had seen on grocery lists, birthday cards, love notes left on the fridge. His hands trembled as he took it. "You should read it," Ethan said softly. "It explains everything." Daniel's throat felt too tight to speak. He wanted to tear the letter open right then, to demand answers from the words Lena had left behind. But another part of him was terrified. What if he didn't like what he found? What if the woman he had loved, the life they had built, had been built on a lie? Ethan took a step back as if giving him space. "I'll come back next week," he said, "if you want to talk." And just like that, he was gone again, leaving Daniel alone with the letter, the grave, and the crushing weight of a secret he had never seen coming. The letter burned in Daniel's hands, heavy with unspoken truths. He stood frozen in the cemetery long after Ethan had disappeared, the wind biting at his skin, but he barely felt it. His entire body was numb, his mind a whirlwind of disbelief and dread. How many times had he wished for one more conversation with Lena? One more chance to hear her voice? Now, here it was, her words waiting for him on a piece of paper. But instead of comfort, all he felt was fear. He couldn't bring himself to open it there, not in front of her grave, not when the ground beneath him already felt like it was crumbling. So he tucked the envelope into his coat pocket and walked away, his steps slow and unsteady, as if the weight of the secret inside that letter was already dragging him down. The drive home was a blur, streetlights smeared into streaks of gold, the hum of the engine distant, like white noise. His hands gripped the wheel too tight, his knuckles pale. When he finally stepped inside the house, the silence was suffocating. Lena's absence had always been a presence of its own, but now it felt different, like the walls themselves were whispering things he wasn't ready to hear. He sank onto the couch, the letter trembling in his hands. For a long time, he just stared at it, tracing the curve of his name in her handwriting. Then, with a deep, shuddering breath, he unfolded it. "My love, if you're reading this, it means 2 things. I'm gone, and Ethan has found you. I'm so sorry you had to learn about him this way. I wanted to tell you, so many times, but I was afraid. Afraid you'd look at me differently, afraid you'd leave, and I couldn't bear that." Daniel's vision blurred. He blinked hard, forcing himself to keep reading. "Before I met you, I was lost. My family was strict, and when I got pregnant they were furious. They said I'd ruined my life. The father wasn't in the picture, and I had no money, no way to raise a child on my own. My aunt, someone I barely knew, offered to take him. She couldn't have children of her own, and she promised he'd be loved. I thought I was doing the right thing, but after I met you, after we built this life together, the guilt ate at me every single day. I thought about telling you so many times, but how could I? You loved me, and I didn't want to break that. I didn't want to break us." A tear splashed onto the paper. Daniel didn't wipe it away. "Ethan doesn't know much about me. His parents, my aunt and her husband, were good to him, but when he turned 16, they gave him the letter I left for him. I wanted him to know the truth if he ever went looking for it. And if he found you, well, I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me. And maybe, just maybe, you can be there for him in ways I never could. He's a part of me, Daniel. And in another life, he could have been a part of you, too." The letter ended there. No dramatic farewell, no final plea. Just silence. Daniel let it fall onto his lap, his chest aching like someone had reached inside and ripped something out. All these years, Lena had carried this alone. All these years he had loved her without knowing this fundamental truth about her. And now there was a boy, his boy in a way, who had grown up without her. Without him. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the quiet room. Daniel sat there, for hours, staring at nothing, the weight of the past pressing down on him. He thought about Ethan's face, the quiet sadness in his eyes. He thought about the way he had stood at Lena's grave, like he was mourning a woman he had never really known. And for the first time since Lena's death, Daniel didn't feel quite so alone. The days blurred together after Daniel read the letter. He moved through his routines mechanically, showering, eating, working, but his mind was elsewhere, trapped in a loop of questions with no answers. He kept replaying his years with Lena, searching for clues he might have missed. Had there been moments when she seemed distant, lost in thoughts she never shared? Times when she flinched at the sight of a child in a park or turned away from baby photos with a strange, hollow look in her eyes? He couldn't remember. The woman he knew had been warm, full of laughter, the kind of person who filled a room with light. Had that all been a mask? Or had she truly locked this part of herself away so completely that even he, the man who shared her bed and her life, never sensed the weight she carried? He thought about Ethan, too. The boy had known where to find him, which meant he had done his research. Had he watched Daniel from a distance before approaching? Had he hesitated, nervous about shattering the life of a man who didn't even know he existed? The thought made Daniel's chest ache. He wondered where Ethan lived, who had raised him, whether he had siblings. Did he look like Lena in other ways? Not just the eyes, but the way she smiled, or the way she tucked her hair behind her ear. When she was thinking? The questions gnawed at him, relentless. By the time Sunday came again, Daniel's nerves were frayed. He arrived at the cemetery earlier than usual, pacing near Lena's grave, his hands shoved deep in his pockets to hide. They're trembling. He wasn't sure what he would say to Ethan, or if the boy would even show up. What if he had changed his mind? What if he'd decided Daniel wasn't worth the trouble? The possibility sent a sharp pang through him, which surprised Daniel with its intensity. He barely knew this boy, and yet the idea of him walking away for good felt like losing Lena all over again. Then he saw him. Ethan was wearing the same jacket as last time, his shoulders hunched slightly against the morning chill. He paused when he spotted Daniel, as if unsure whether to approach. Daniel raised a hand in a tentative wave, and after a beat, Ethan returned the gesture and walked over. "You read it," Ethan said quietly. It wasn't a question. Daniel nodded. "Yeah, I read it." A long silence stretched between them. Somewhere in the distance, a bird trilled, the sound too cheerful for the heaviness in the air. "I don't know what to say," Daniel admitted finally, his voice rough. "I keep thinking, if she'd just told me." He trailed off, shaking, his head. Ethan scuffed the toe of his shoe against the grass. Would it have changed anything, if you'd known? The question hit Daniel like a punch. Would it have? He wanted to say no, to insist that he would have loved Lena just the same, that he would have welcomed Ethan into their lives without hesitation. But the truth was messier. He'd been younger then, more rigid in his expectations of life. Would he have understood, or would he have felt betrayed, lied to? The uncertainty shamed him. "I'd like to think it wouldn't have changed a thing," he said at last. "But I don't know, and that's the part that kills me." Ethan absorbed this, his expression unreadable. Then, to Daniel's surprise, he asked, "Do you want to get coffee or something? There's a lot. I think we should talk, if you're up for it." Daniel exhaled, something unclenching in his chest. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I'd like that." As they walked out of the cemetery together, Daniel stole a glance at the boy. His son, he supposed, though the word still felt foreign. He didn't know what came next, or how they'd navigate this tangled mess of secrets and half-truths. But for the first time in weeks, the future didn't feel quite so empty. The coffee shop was quiet, the kind of place Lena would have loved. Soft. Lighting, overstuffed chairs, the rich aroma of freshly ground beans hanging in the air. Daniel led Ethan to a corner table, away from the few other customers, his hands still unsteady as he set down his mug. The steam curled upward, vanishing into nothing, much like the life he thought he'd had before that first day in the cemetery. He studied Ethan across the table, really studied him, searching for more pieces of Lena in the slope of his nose, the way he held his cup. There were traces of her everywhere now that he knew to look, but there were other things, too. a stubborn, set to his jaw that felt unfamiliar, a habit of tapping his fingers against the table when he was thinking. Daniel wondered which parts of this boy belonged to a father he'd never met, a man who had slipped out of Lena's life before Daniel had even entered it. Ethan took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes flickering up to meet Daniel's before darting away again. "So," he said, clearing his throat, "I guess you probably have questions." Daniel let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "That's one way to put it." He hesitated, then went with the simplest one first. "Your parents, the ones who raised you, are they good people?" Ethan said quickly, as if he'd been waiting for this. "They never lied to me about being adopted. They just didn't know much about my birth mom until a few years ago, when she reached out to them." He paused, his fingers tightening around his cup. "They didn't tell me, though. Not until after she died. They thought it was better to wait until I was older." Daniel winced. So Lena had tried, at the end. She'd reached out. The thought of her mustering the courage to contact Ethan's family, not knowing if they'd respond, not knowing if she'd ever get to see her son, it carved something hollow inside him. "Do you blame her?" he asked quietly. "For giving you up?" Ethan's shoulders lifted in a shrug, but his voice was tight. "I don't know. Sometimes. But the letter she left me, it explained things. How young she was, how scared. It's not like in movies, where you find out and suddenly everything makes sense. It's just a lot." He looked up, holding Daniel's gaze for the first time. "What about you? Do you blame her?" The question hung between them, heavy and raw. Daniel stared into his coffee, watching the dark liquid ripple as his hands trembled. Did he? He wanted to say no, to be the bigger person, but the truth was more complicated. There was anger there, sharp and unexpected, not just at Lena, but at himself, for never suspecting, for loving someone so completely and still not knowing her. "I think," he said slowly, "that I wish she'd trusted me enough to tell me, even if it changed things, even if it hurt." Ethan nodded like he understood. Maybe he did. They lapsed into silence again, but it wasn't as strained as before. Daniel found himself cataloging the little things, the way Ethan stirred his coffee exactly 3 times, the way he pushed his sleeves up when he got too warm, just like Lena used to. It was surreal, sitting here with a piece of her that he hadn't even known existed. "So, what now?" Ethan asked finally, voicing the question that had been circling Daniel's mind all morning. Daniel took a deep breath. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'd like to try, if you want to." Ethan studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, just when Daniel was sure he'd overstepped, the corner of the boy's mouth quirked up, just slightly, just enough. "Yeah," he said, "I think I'd like that too." Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a sudden golden light across their table. It felt like a sign, or maybe just a coincidence. Either way, for the first time in a long time, Daniel let himself hope. The weeks that followed were strange and tentative, like learning to walk on uneven ground. Daniel and Ethan began meeting regularly, sometimes at the coffee shop, sometimes at a park near Ethan's school, once even at Daniel's house, though. That visit had been stiff and awkward, filled with too many unspoken thoughts as Ethan wandered through the rooms Lena had once filled with life. Daniel found himself doing things he hadn't done in years, paying attention to school schedules, remembering what snacks Ethan liked, hesitating outside store windows when he saw a hoodie or a book that made him think he might like this. It was terrifying, this sudden responsibility, this unasked-for fatherhood that had crashed into his life decades too late. Ethan, for his part, seemed just as uncertain. He would share bursts of information about himself, how he played guitar but wasn't very good, how he hated tomatoes but loved ketchup, how he'd gotten a B+ on his history paper, then retreat into silence as if afraid he'd said too much. Daniel could tell he was holding back questions, the big ones that hung between them like storm clouds. Do you regret not knowing me? Would you have wanted me if you'd known? Do you think she loved me? Really loved me? Or was I just a mistake she tried to fix? Daniel didn't know how to answer those, not yet, so he let them linger, hoping time would make them easier to face. Then, one rainy afternoon, Ethan showed up at Daniel's door unannounced, his hair plastered to his forehead, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. "Can I come in?" he asked, and something in his voice made Daniel step aside without a word. They sat in the living room, the rain tapping against the windows like impatient fingers. Ethan didn't reach for the soda Daniel offered. He just sat there, staring at his hands, until finally he said, "I found something. In her letter, my mom's letter, there was a part I didn't tell you about." Daniel's stomach dropped. "What part?" Ethan pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket, clearly well read, the creases soft from handling. "She wrote about my father, not the one who got her pregnant. You." Daniel went very still. "She said," she thought, "about telling you when you two got serious, but then she found out you couldn't have kids, that you talked about it early on, how it didn't matter to you, because you'd never wanted children anyway." Ethan's voice was flat, but his hands shook. "Except then she got sick, and she realized she'd taken that choice from you, the chance to know you had a son. Even if you didn't want me, she thought you should have had the choice." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. He had said that years ago, back when he and Lena were first dating. He'd been young, careless, trying to sound worldly when really he was just repeating what his own father had always said, that kids were a burden, a chain around your ankles. He'd never imagined— "Ethan," he started. But the boy stood, abruptly. "I get it, okay? I thought you should know why she didn't tell you. It wasn't just about her." He headed for the door, shoulders hunched against whatever Daniel might say next. "Wait." Daniel stood so fast his knee protested. "That was a lifetime ago. I didn't know what I was talking about back then." Ethan paused, his hand on the doorknob. "And now?" Daniel's throat tightened. There were 100 things he could say, but only one that mattered. "Now, I can't imagine not knowing you." The rain fell harder, pounding against the roof. Ethan didn't turn around, but his grip on the doorknob loosened, and for the first time Daniel realized he meant it, every word. The truth settled between them like dust after a storm, uneasy at first, but slowly finding its place. Daniel watched Ethan's back, the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers still gripped the doorknob like he might bolt at any second. The rain outside had turned the world into a blur of gray and green, muffling everything except the sound of their breathing. Daniel knew this was the moment that would define them, the line between walking away and stepping forward, and the weight of it pressed down on him until he could barely draw air into his lungs. He took a step closer, then another, until he was standing just behind Ethan, close enough to see the dampness of his jacket from the rain, the way his hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, another thing he must have gotten from Lena. "I meant what I said," Daniel repeated, quieter this time. "I don't know how this works. I don't know how to be a father. But I want to. Try. If you'll let me." Ethan didn't turn around, but his head dipped slightly like a puppet with its strings cut. "Why?" The word was barely audible over the rain. "You didn't ask for this. You didn't even know I existed until a few weeks ago. You could just walk away. No one would blame you." Daniel exhaled, long and slow. He could walk away. That was the truth of it. He could close the door on this messy, complicated situation and go back to the quiet, predictable grief he'd been living in before Ethan showed up. But the thought of it, of never seeing that flicker of Lena in Ethan's smile, of never learning the sound of his laugh when he wasn't holding back, made something in his chest ache worse than the loneliness ever had. "I could walk away," Daniel admitted, "but I don't want to." He reached out, hesitated, then placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. The boy stiffened but didn't pull away. "You're part of her. And yeah, that's why I noticed you at first. But now?" He shook his head, even though Ethan couldn't see it. "Now I keep showing up because of you. Because I want to know you. Because it matters to me that you're okay." Ethan turned then, finally, his eyes red-rimmed but dry. He searched Daniel's face like he was looking for lies, for hesitation, but whatever he found seemed to steady him. "I don't know how this works either," he muttered. Daniel huffed a quiet laugh. "Then I guess we figure it out together." Epilogue. The grave was no longer just a place of grief. Daniel still visited every Sunday, but now Ethan came with him more often than not. They would stand side by side in comfortable silence, sometimes talking to Lena, sometimes just listening to the wind in the trees. Daniel told her about his week, about the projects at work, about how Ethan had finally beaten him at chess after months of trying. Ethan would update her on school, on music, on the latest drama with his friends. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of awkwardness, of uncertainty, of grief so sharp it stole their breath. But there was also this, a fragile, hard-won peace. One Sunday in early spring, as they turned to leave, Ethan hesitated. "Do you think she knows?" he asked abruptly. "That we found each other?" Daniel looked back at the headstone. The flowers. They'd brought bright against the gray stone. He thought of the letter, of the pain and love woven through every word, of the woman who had carried so much alone. "Yeah," he said softly. "I think she knows." And for the first time in a long time, it felt like enough.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.